The civil rights movement of the 1960s is actually born out of the Founding Fathers' Declaration of Independence, where it says all men are created equal and that they're endowed with life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Now, as we know, the founding generation failed to live up to that promise for many minority groups, African Americans included. The Civil War was fought over the issue of slavery, and during Reconstruction, there was three amendments passed. The first was the 13th, and then the 14th and the 15th Amendment. Together, these Reconstruction amendments were designed to provide equality, at least under the law, to the new freedmen. Of course, gender issues were still there, but when Reconstruction ended and the Jim Crow legislation was passed in the states, the promise of the Reconstruction amendments was lost as well. The Jim Crow laws, remember, were more than just voting rights restrictions, although that was a big part of it. The Jim Crow laws were designed to segregate and keep African Americans and other minority groups separate from the white population. In a very real sense, it was a white supremacist law. Now, that was mostly in the South, and we can see that some of this mentality does arrive in the North, especially in urban areas. However, the civil rights movement of the post-World War II era is an effort to recapture that promise of both the Declaration of Independence and the 13th, 14th, and 15th Reconstruction Amendments, and trying to overcome Jim Crow legislation, especially in the South, but promote equality all over the country. Another important piece of context for understanding the civil rights movement of the 50s and 60s is World War II itself. Now, during World War II, you have to remember that the United States was fighting an evil racist regime because the Nazis were, Aryan white supremacists, and they were targeting Jews and other minorities. But we have a situation in the United States where you have white supremacists in the South implementing Jim Crow legislation. So there's some interesting pieces of context. First, during the war, African Americans had fought against discrimination in the war industries. War industries would often, at this time, the war industries were segregated. However, because of protests led by some people like A. Philip Randolph, the war industries were desegregated by Harry Truman. Truman started the Fair Employment Practices Commission, which tried to make these war industry jobs more accessible to African Americans. One problem, though, is when those white soldiers came back from war, many of the African Americans lost their jobs to those returning soldiers, which became an issue. Also, the actual fighting of World War II was done in segregated units. The military itself was still segregated, even though we were fighting what was viewed as a racist regime. Those African Americans that did join the military were not only were they segregated, but if you're from the North and didn't really face legal segregation, oftentimes these soldiers were sent into the South to train at the forts there, sometimes facing Jim Crow for the first time. Surprisingly, when some soldiers came back from World War II, some African American soldiers were actually lynched when they got back to their hometown. In light of all of this information, Harry Truman started the Civil Rights Commission. And that Civil Rights Commission proposed that there be new anti-lynching laws passed, which were passed under the Truman administration. And Truman, by executive order, actually desegregated the military. Now, this had a very rapid and interesting response, which we'll get to later. One other piece of context is that in the post-war era, the true nature of the Holocaust was finally revealed in full. There was always suspicions of targeting of Jews and other minority populations, but when the United States population realized that it was 6 million Jewish people killed for nothing more than the crime of being Jewish, and 6 million other people killed for things like being a gypsy, homosexual, having a communicable disease. Some of these issues were, they didn't live up to the American ideal. And Americans began to call into question their own racial practices. When the returning soldiers start pushing things like the Double V campaign and pushing for civil rights, many Americans looked at the context of the Holocaust, the segregation of World War II, and the fighting spirit of the men there, and the long historic promises, and decided to make a change. One final bit of context before we get into the actual civil rights movement is the Cold War itself. Now, in the post-war America, we are fighting the Soviet Union in really an undeclared war. That doesn't mean there wasn't any fighting, but what we were fighting for was not necessarily land, and we weren't necessarily fighting with bullets. What we were fighting for was allies. Sometimes these are called third world nations. Now, the Soviet Union had its Eastern Bloc in Eastern Europe, and the United States had its allies in Western Europe. But we were still fighting the Soviet Union, trying to prove that we were the better country. We were trying to gain those allies in places like Africa and Asia and other territories. So the United States wanted that support, and we wanted to prove that we were better than the what we saw as evil, ungodly communists. The civil rights movement had a number of tactics trying to point out the hypocrisy of what was happening in the United States because of segregation and Jim Crow, and in that way, pointing out the hypocrisy and getting the United States to change it so that we would look good on the international stage, so that we could gain those allies and we'd have moral superiority over the what was perceived as evil communists.